Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Claire. I'm a contract librarian on assignment here with NOAA Central Library. This seminar series is offered through the NOAA Central Library Seminar Program, which provides an educational forum for the presentation of ideas, research updates, and news in support of NOAA's mission. Before we start, I have some technical tips for attendees. Just so you are aware, you are muted and you're not able to unmute. However, if you have a question, you can type it into the question panel, and we'll get to those during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. If you're having any audio or visual issues, if you can't hear the speaker or see the slides, please try logging off and logging back on, and that will solve most issues in GoToWebinar. And just as a reminder, this is being recorded. If you'd like to revisit this seminar or view previous seminars, you can do that on our YouTube channel. Now I'm going to turn it over to Peg, who's going to introduce our speaker today.
Thanks so much, Claire. Greetings. Welcome to everyone to our 2022 EBM EBFM seminar series. We continue this year after starting in November 2017. Our aim is to really increase awareness regarding ecosystem-based management, specifically ecosystem-based fisheries management, and highlight the progress that NOAA and our partners are making to implement. And today, we're very happy to have Josh Nowlis, one of our partners, who is the founder and president of Bridge Environment. And his presentation will focus in on adaptive implementable management, AIM, a new take on an old paradigm. We offered this series, as Claire has indicated, and record it, so it's available if you have colleagues that will miss it today. They can always see it on our YouTube channel. We offer the series on the second Wednesday of each month at between 3 and 4 p.m. Eastern Time. And we want to thank many of our speakers and all the attendees who often provide us with suggestions and recommendations for future speakers. I just want to remind you that we have another presentation in July 13th. Tori Kentner and Chris Hack will give us an update on the Northeast Regional Habitat Assessment project that's been underway for some time. So stay tuned for that July 13th presentation. So Josh, great to hear you and see you. Josh and I were in the leadership program here at NOAA some years ago. We don't want to count the years, but it's great to reconnect with you. And thanks again, Josh.
Yeah, thank you so much, Peg. I am so grateful for the opportunity to chat with such a relevant group for the work that I have been doing, honestly, ever since way back when we did the leadership program. I left NOAA right after that and had been faced with a really tough choice between contributing to leadership of an agency that I have nothing but incredible fondness for and whose mission is so directly related to my passions, or to go back to grad school. And I did that, ended up going back and studying economics and psychology. And I did it specifically because I was working on this new paradigm for addressing management issues. This paradigm applies to things beyond fisheries. There will be a link later in the talk to a presentation I gave about a month ago where I provided the application of this approach to a variety of issues with a particular focus on climate change. And so people are interested in that. Certainly, you're welcome to try to jot down that detail while I'm going through the slides, but better yet, just ask for a copy of the presentation. This is something that's going to be made available to anybody, either the slides themselves or also the YouTube video that will be up, it sounds like, very shortly. Okay, so with no further ado, let's jump into adaptive implementable management. Okay, so it's always helpful when you're proposing something new to really get at what the problem is and why we really even need this. And so the problem, and this is something that I am aware of from lots of experience working within NOAA on domestic fisheries, working within NOAA on international fisheries, and the fisheries that are sort of out there in the territories that are a little bit in, that have some dynamics that are similar to each of conventional 48 states plus Alaska fisheries, but also with some international flair to them. And then actually extensive work that I've been doing over the past several years as a partner to NOAA on international implementation of fisheries management in places where fisheries are undermanaged or more often completely unmanaged. And in every one of these cases, it's very common to see ecosystem-based fisheries management or an alternative, a variant of that, ecosystem approaches to fisheries management as infeasible. And so if you can imagine going to Indonesia, a place I've worked quite a bit in several years, when we present them with the idea of here's a great way to be able to manage your fisheries, three concerns almost always come up. Scientific inadequacies. More often than not, that just comes up in the form of we don't have any data, or we have some data, but it's really not very useful. It certainly is not enough to be able to put together a full formal stock assessment model. And so we often describe these as data limited cases, but that's one of the barriers. And and I should say this is a perception of scientific inadequacies. I hope to convince you by the end of this talk that that this is not a valid excuse. We can go far even with those scientific inadequacies. Similarly, there's a very common concern about barriers to implementing regulation. That will come in the form of just saying, well, our fishing communities don't really respect the government agency. We've got very limited enforcement resources. And so we can put some rules in, but the reality is that they'll just be on paper and not actually applied in the real world. Again, this is a perception. It's one where the system that I present you, along with some other really great systems people have been working on for some time now, are ways to be able to involve communities in ways that that really promote both not only being able to use enforcement in some kind of way, but really getting a sense of buy-in and compliance. And then lastly, and this is really widespread, is technical capacity gaps, that there aren't people that are trained in advanced stock assessment methodologies. There aren't people that are trained in compliance and enforcement techniques. And certainly aren't, if they get some training in EBFM or EAFM, it's just a very broad level. So it's really hard for people to come from training like that to sitting down and actually implementing functional fisheries management. Now, unfortunately, these challenges are exacerbated by the psychology that we bring to environmental policy issues, and in all reality, to almost every policy issue that we face. And this is one of the big things that motivated me to go to grad school, was to get a better understanding of these concerns that we should have when we go into these policy negotiations and policy debates. One is our cognitive psychological tendencies. When our brains are faced with making a choice about something that is going to have future consequences, but where we're really not quite sure how that future is going to unfold. In other words, there's uncertainty. And I hope that everybody's making the connection. This is just about every policy issue we ever deal with. Our brains have a really strong tendency to have one of two reactions. One is to just ignore the uncertainty altogether and come up with solutions, or come up with statements like, we will deal with that later. There's not enough uncertainty to really think about that. That's unproven. All of these are excuses that are justifying this emotional reaction that comes from the way our brain is wired to a decision when there's future uncertainty. But interestingly, the second most common reaction to making a decision about an uncertain future is basically panic. So it's to be really worried about that, to end up over emphasizing the uncertainty that's involved, and in many cases to not necessarily make the best rational decisions about things, because it's more of an emotional, almost a panic reflex. Now, when you put those people having those two reactions into a common group, or into a group setting, whether that is a policy negotiation, whether it's two different sides of an issue inside a country where you have political and media folks all communicating about this, those two groups do not mix well. And our social psychological tendencies are, when we see another group as being some sort of the other side, people that we don't agree with, but more importantly, that we feel we can't really trust because we believe that they're ignoring the issue or they're freaking out about the issue. We have a very poor track record as human beings at being able to sit down and have a rational and reasonable negotiation. Now, if you're interested in these issues and you want, I've provided the link here. As I said, I don't expect you to write all this down, but you will have access to this. There's a seminar I did last month talking about these issues and then how this AIM approach, more broadly defined beyond fisheries, is something that can do a lot to temper those two tendencies. Okay, but let's just start by acknowledging that the US has actually been a real leader when it comes to ecosystem-based fisheries management. Going all the way back to 1973, when during the third UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, the US was one of the strong advocates for establishing a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone that was motivated primarily by fishing back then, although there was quickly people became aware that there were also some mineral resources there, and so that is now one of the major driving factors for EEZ dynamics. But nonetheless, the U.S. in both their sort of motivation of the time and in documents that come out about the UN clause really emphasized the fact that by taking control over the continental shelf and the areas around the continental shelf, that we have a greater ability to be able to manage things in a way that's sustainable. And this is reflected in the 1976 Magnuson Act, which was definitely a response to this ongoing EEZ issue, which took a while to be sort of officially adopted around the world. But the U.S., we were proponents of this and believe strongly in it. So the Magnuson Act is a huge document, but I'll just highlight two specific things from 76. One is that a key purpose of the 76 Act was to conserve and manage fish stocks, and then based on optimum yield. So conserve and manage are the two key words there. But optimum yield in 76 was defined as providing the greatest benefit to the nation with respect to food production and recreational opportunities. So focused on really what use values we'd get from fisheries, and then some very specific words that have a lot to do with how we manage fisheries on the basis of MSY as modified by any relevant economic, social, or ecological factor. So we're supposed to think about MSY as a key benchmark in managing our fisheries. But in 76, we then would modify what our actual target was based on these factors. But that could be modified in either direction of less aggressive fishing or more aggressive fishing. And it turned out that we had a lot of cases of more aggressive fishing that happened from that. So 96, the law was modified. That was referred to as the Sustainable Fisheries Act, specifically referencing these two modifications. One modification is that the purpose had the words taking into account the protection of marine ecosystems added to it. So we're moving towards an EBFM sort of approach in our legal framework. And then optimum yield was, the definition of optimum yield was revised from as modified by relevant factors to as reduced by relevant factors. So we were explicitly committing to never fishing more aggressively than an MSY level. There were still issues that happened with that. And one of the key problems with the 96 Act and the way it was implemented is that there are so many fisheries where we can't estimate MSY very reliably. And so there was a common approach to just kind of ignore those stocks or put some very, very general regulations there that were not terribly enforced, often weren't even monitored. So a 2007 amendment of the Magnuson Act added that a requirement for annual catch limits for each managed fisheries. So all of these steps that we've taken within the major US policy for fisheries have been moving us towards really living this concept of EBFM, one that scientists in the US have also really contributed significantly to, including at NOAA. Okay, so that's the US system, but even within the US system, we still see real limits to the implementation of EBFM across all of our fisheries. you can just go to a place like the Caribbean Fishery Management Council, one that I've done a lot of work with, to be able to see that there's the desire to do these things, but people really feel like they're struggling with how you implement them. Why? All the reasons that we just talked about in terms of the things that I run across when I work internationally. Beliefs in scientific inadequacies, belief that regulation, that there are significant barriers to implementing regulations, and technical capacity gaps. Because even though NOAA does serve all US territories and states, the reality is that if you go to a place like the Caribbean, they don't have the same university settings, they don't have the same amount of scientific capacity there that you would have even just in Miami. And even though the folks in Miami have some real responsibility in the Caribbean, which was part of my job when I worked for NOAA, the reality is that that's something that has to be balanced with 2 other management councils plus ICAT from just the Southeast Fisheries Management, Southeast Fisheries Science Center. And so inevitably there's just not nearly as much technical capacity as we would want there. But then these same psychological tendencies really play in. When we try to implement policy and we haven't addressed those, things tend to not go well. And that's, going back to the Caribbean Council, just because this is my experience, this is the history of the Caribbean Management Council going back to the 90s. This idea of saying, well, we need to come up with some kind of a catch limit, but we don't really have data to be able to come up with a decent assessment of how healthy these fish stocks are. And people variously throwing out sort of policy ideas of, well, can we do this? And either the policy is something that just doesn't really affect anything. So it's, it maybe looks good on paper, but there isn't a lot of tread to grip with it. Or the policy is one where the fishing community says that's going to destroy our livelihood, and there isn't the interest or will in pursuing those policies, and so those are dropped. So all of these things contribute to limitations in our own application of EBFM to the US. All right, so I'm going to propose an antidote to this, and this antidote is not sort of a wildly brand new idea. It actually takes 2 existing ideas, but puts them together in such a way that it really emphasizes the strengths of each of these 2 approaches. It facilitates connections between the 2 approaches in ways that ultimately leads to fisheries management systems that are better integrated. But when it comes to the psychology part and really the ability to implement it, there are a couple of things that this AIM approach really does particularly well. It emphasizes honest communication about uncertainty. And that's a hard discussion to have because there is a lot of scientific uncertainty, and that's something that's not comfortable to talk about. And even when we try to talk about it, typically scientists and non-scientists have very different language and even currencies that matter to them when they think about uncertainty. So it's difficult to make this bridge between those 2 worlds. So this approach provides some really what are designed to be really just help aids in making a much better communication about uncertainty. Even though we still have all of those issues that have been brought up previously, the AIM approach, actually really does effectively fill in gaps in management strategies, meaning here of application of EBFM, by focusing on performance first and foremost. Science is crucial, but it's second, and that's a reversal of how things often happen. So once we have a sense of what we're trying to get out of a fishery, then we use as much science as we have to be able to move us in the direction to do that. And when we put this all together, we shift that psychology away from those gut reactions that are really not conducive to having constructive negotiations about policies, and instead it puts people into a mindset of deliberative risk management. So let me tell you more about what this approach is. Okay, so the AIM approach consists of 2 adaptive management cycles. There's one that can be described as the management plan review and revision cycle. For anybody who has seen ecosystem approaches to fisheries management material that's taught all over the world, and NOAA had a significant contribution to the development of This is a reformulation of that. I mean, there really isn't anything in here that isn't already discussed in trainings around EBFM and EAFM. So what are the key elements of this? We define objectives, so we get a sense of what is it we're trying to do with this management system. We design a management system itself, which is going to include a harvest strategy, something I'll talk about in a second. We enact that management, we monitor the performance of it. Periodically, we evaluate that performance, and based on the evaluation and of not only the performance of the system, but also things like have attitudes changed in the community that this fishery is serving, we will go back and repeat that cycle. Harvest strategy is another thing. I did not invent harvest strategies. I discovered them back when I worked for NOAA. They were around as early as the late 1970s in the forums that were looking at marine mammal management. So the International Whaling Commission in particular, Doug Burworth and Andre Punt had put together something they called a management procedure, which is really a harvest strategy there. The elements are basically the same. And what this does, which is different from just a general approach, is it is very focused on assessing the state or the health of a population using data that's collected with that purpose specifically in mind. And then the thing that's really unique is it applies a harvest control rule, which is a predefined formula that says, based on what our estimate of stock health is, this is how fishing opportunity needs to be adjusted. Maybe it can stay the same, maybe it needs to go up or down, but the amount of fishing pressure, the amount of fishing pressure that's going to be allowed is going to be dictated by this formula rather than by a long policy process with lots of latitude for making decisions. And so once that formula is calculated, then we have to go in and figure out how to adjust management measures that are capable of being adjusted. So ones I would refer to as dynamic. And so that's the harvest strategy. Both of these are things I have not, as I mentioned, I really want to make it clear. I did not invent either one of these things, and they're both great ideas. But what I did do is put them together in a way that that works, I would argue, much better as a system. In order to do that, we want to start by thinking about what does each of those adaptive management loops do well. And so to start with, the management plan review and revision is, you can think of it as basically sort of like aiming, and you can even think of it maybe as being sort of in the cannonball era. And I apologize for this being somewhat militaristic, but I came to discover, thinking about this through a collaboration that I had with a guy who designed missile guidance systems named Bruce Bollerman. We did a project back at just about the year 2000. And I even launched a campaign at that point that was called "It Does Take a Rocket Scientist to Manage a Fishery," because I thought this was so interesting and useful. But yeah, so essentially, in working with Bruce, we came to the conclusion that fisheries were still in the cannonball era, and in some places they still really are, where what we do is we have some idea of what we want. So we take some care to be able to aim our cannon. We make some care to put in the right amount of powder in there to be able to have the right velocity out of the cannon. But then at the end of the day, we have to light that fuse, cross our fingers and hope, because at that point, there's nothing we can do. If the target moves, if a wind kicks in, if anything uncertain comes through, from the time that we light the fuse onwards, our aim was, even if we had really done a good job of aiming in the first place, is not going to be true. This is even more complicated when we're not so great at being able to figure out where we're aiming the cannon because of things like data limitations. But nonetheless, management plan review and revision can be thought of as being like aiming, whereas a harvest strategy can be thought of like a self-guided missile system. The self-guided missile, rather than being committed to a particular path when it's launched, it is constantly evaluating where it is and making adjustments in exactly the same way that a harvest strategy does. So a harvest strategy really is just an algorithm that is completely analogous to what we use for missile guidance systems. And I should point out, fun fact on Bruce, even though I provided this in a militaristic sort of way, Bruce actually worked on space stuff, but one of his big achievements is he actually provided NOAA with some of the earliest well-designed weather balloons to be able to maintain their position and get to where they needed to go. So Bruce has this fun old connection to NOAA. All right, so looking at these two aspects of AIM that way, we can think about the management plan review and revision cycle as aiming. This is one that is what we're really thinking about the future. We're thinking about what is it that we ultimately want to get out of this. We are forecasting into the future, which brings in all of those psychological challenges that we mentioned. The AIM part of this is slow. In order to do this right, we are getting really deep in with stakeholders, whether they be fishing groups, conservation groups, whoever it is that we're dealing with, this is the opportunity to be able to really make sure that their voices are being represented in the policies that we do. So we have to slow down and listen on that. But a nice perk of this management plan review and revision is because we're really, it should be so focused on performance towards objectives that we can get really creative with this. And I'll give you some examples at the end of the talk to be able to illustrate that. So that's a way of characterizing that one cycle. By contrast, the harvest strategy, the adjusting part of it, it's not forecast, it's not future-based, it's forecast, it's past-based. It's looking at sort of where did we go, and then it's reacting to figure out what we have to do to start getting back on target. Because it's formulaic, and that also means that it's really fast. We don't have to wait for stakeholders. And because of the formula, it's self-adjusting, which means that this can be very strategic. So that's a summary of the two cycles. So now let's just look at how you would take those two cycles in a very general way and apply them. So step one is going to be defining objectives, which includes, to make a good objective, we really have to, especially for this particular technique, we really have to have a clear idea of what are the conflicts in the system. Where are the places where people are either individually struggling with, well, on the one hand, I like this, but on the other hand, I'd like this other thing, and I can't have both because there is a fundamental constraint here, or where one group is saying, we want more of this, and another group is saying, well, we want more of this other thing. Those, if we can dig into objectives enough to where we're clearly identifying that degree of conflict, then when we make decisions, we can make a decision that's explicitly about finding whatever balance seems to be the appropriate one for those objectives, which really is not NOAA's job. That's why we have fishery management councils and participatory systems for that to represent ultimately society and not NOAA. But NOAA can end up providing dramatically better advice if we're really clear about what those conflicts are. So we can say alternative A seems to be better for this particular objective than this other one. Alternative B's maybe a little bit better the other way around. If the stakeholders want to get together and propose a alternative C that's somewhere in between, we can provide analysis and show how, relative performance of those sorts of things. But this also comes into play in the monitoring and evaluation side of things, that when we've made a decision about what it is we're ultimately trying to get in terms of these trade-offs, if we design our monitoring and evaluation systems well, we can do a good job of tracking if we're doing what we were intending or not. And that turns out to be extremely useful from the perspective of involving stakeholders, because if the stakeholders feel like not only did we listen to what they're concerned about at the beginning, even to the point of getting into the dirty stuff that people don't necessarily want to talk about, these conflicts that are happening, that we enabled them to have a negotiation of ultimately what the balance should be in these trade-offs. But then even better, we are committing to providing data that everybody can look at a few years down the line to say, this is what we had agreed we wanted to achieve. This is what it actually looked like. Should we go back to the drawing board for some or all of this? So using performance as the major focus for that does amazing things for the dynamics with stakeholders. Okay, so defining objectives and is a key part of that. Once we've gone through that and had the discussion about trade-offs, allowed communities to be able to come up with their preferred version of what they'd like to see, we can then help put that into very specifics that would be akin to aiming, what is our target here? You know, what are we aiming for in this fishery? We're going to let that run for a little bit, but as it runs, the harvest strategy is going to be something that we design to keep us on target if we're there, or to move us on into target if we're not there yet. So that's step 2 is going to be this harvest strategy doing that self-adjusting for us. And by having that self-adjusting, we have what I refer to as responsiveness in this policy. We don't sit there and hem and haw as we watch something gradually degrade until we finally decide, yes, this really is an issue, and now we have to come up with some kind of management measures where we have a big problem. Instead, this is one where we are catching problems early by using the harvest strategy, but that harvest control rule to tell us, even though we dropped a little bit, we're going to adjust the fishing pressure down so we can quickly move back up to where we want to be. So harvest strategies with the harvest control rule instill discipline and responsiveness. But then periodically, we're going to come back and re-aim to both sort of consider if people's preferences have changed in terms of performance, but just as importantly, to see if there's ways that we can tinker with things to better achieve the preferred performance. And I should highlight, this is something we don't do in the US typically. If we're going to do this in a full and honest way, that means that we should be revisiting the harvest strategy, including the harvest control rule. To my knowledge, even though harvest control rules went into the US in the early 2000s, I think there may only be one that has been revisited to as far as I'm aware. And yeah, that's definitely something to keep in mind in terms of doing an even better job of applying EBFM within the US. All right, so let's go into that first step with a little bit more detail. And I'm just going to go quickly through this to give a flavor of what this is like before going into some examples. So first step in implementing AIM is the objectives. And this is going to require intensive community engagement. We're going to go through and define objectives in ways that I've already discussed, where we really focus on what are the conflicts, what are the trade-offs. And then when we're doing that with AIM, what we can do that we don't necessarily do a great job of otherwise is we can really tailor our monitoring and evaluation system specific to those key conflicts. When there's a conflict, that's where it's especially important that we are supporting a positive societal collaboration on this by giving people data about how we're doing at achieving what we hoped would be the preferred trade-off for that. So people will potentially, well, not more than potentially, people will disagree about what the ultimate priority should be, but the part of the process through the council should be making a decision that reflects compromises that people make, and monitoring and evaluation can end up really supporting that if we design them much more targeted at those issues. Okay. Second step in that first part of it is identifying management measures. So we're going to have some management measures that don't get adjusted in between cycles through the management plan review and revision process. Some things are just difficult to make adjustments on a quick sort of a quick time frame. Take a marine protected area, for example. If we were to create a system where a marine protected area grew and shrank as we got different information about stock status, that would, in every community I've ever worked with, would create absolute chaos. So that's not a great dynamic management measure, but it's one that still can be included. It would just stay within that AIM cycle on the left. The harvest strategy is going to focus instead on management measures that are dynamic, ones where we can make changes. And there's almost always measures that are conducive to making changes every time we come up with a new assessment about a stock. That can be things like the length of close seasons. It can be that's really the most common one that comes up when I work around the world, is that, but sometimes it's if there's limited entry systems where there's some fluidity to the community structure with that, you can actually adjust the number of permits up and down. That's another thing that often comes up. But whatever the management measures are going to be, this has to come through a collaboration between community, scientists, and people that are knowledgeable about enforcement. I'm going to just put a little flag here for something called FishPath, the tool. Because while the US does this in general, does this a pretty good job, FishPath has actually been applied to US systems, but we use FishPath a lot in other places as a decision support tool for picking management measures that are ones that are feasible under the circumstances of a fishery. Okay. Then we also need to design the science for the harvest strategy, separate from monitoring and evaluation. We also want to be collecting data that's going to give us those regular pictures of the health of the fish stock. This is something that also in the US we actually have really, sort of world-class systems, particularly for our data moderate and data rich stocks. The data limited ones are ones we still struggle with, but there are some really bright people that work on that in the US. That was one of the things I was really interested in when I was a stock assessment scientist for NOAA. But when I take this idea of developing fisheries management to most other places in the world, there really isn't capacity for this. So it's something that we have to work on, even just from the sort of most basic questions of what data are we going to collect and what models are we going to use to assess fish stocks. Turns out FishPath is also a very useful tool for that. So let's, oh, and I just wanted to mention this too. I've actually done bits and pieces of assisting with NOAA's next generation data acquisition plan. And these things are very relevant to those sorts of discussions. And I can say from having sat through a number of discussions on that, thinking about ways to make these scientific endeavors relevant to the objectives of fisheries is a place where there's a lot of rich room to be able to enhance the value of what we do as an agency. All right, so what is FishPath? To start with, I want to acknowledge that FishPath was developed through a collaboration between Nature Conservancy, Natalie Dowling with CSIRO in Australia, and then NOAA's very own Jason Cope, who is a stock assessment scientist in the Northwest Fisheries Science Center. What is FishPath? FishPath is, you can think of it as being an expert server with a really extensive menu. And that server is going to ask you lots of, if you were to tell the server, well, I'm not sure, what would you recommend? The server can come to you by describing or asking you questions about, well, what's your budget? Are there things that you're allergic to? Do you have other restrictions, maybe based on values, religious or otherwise? Are you concerned about wanting to have lower or higher calories? What are your tastes? Ask lots of questions, and then based on all of those questions, a talented server can come back and give you a recommendation for an appetizer, a main course, and a dessert based on your answers, but also based on the three of those things making a nice meal together. FishPath does this very thing, and I'm providing a link here. You can try it. This is something that, even though it was developed through this collaboration, and Nature Conservancy, I guess, sort of officially has the intellectual property rights over it, in part because of NOAA's significant contribution to it. This is a free tool available online. All right. So when it comes to actually running FishPath, there are lots of questions about things like fleets, governance, socioeconomics, biology, data. FishPath then considers that not in terms of appetizers, main courses, and desserts, but it considers it in terms of data collection methodologies, stock assessment methodologies, and management measures that might potentially work for a fishery. So there's an algorithm that takes answers that you provide to questions about all these different characteristics of a fishery, and it then evaluates lots of different techniques. In fact, the effort or the intention is to have these techniques for data assessments and management measures be comprehensive, so that anything you can imagine would be in this system, and that the algorithm would provide the relative strengths and weaknesses of each of those approaches. And so when you run FishPath, the results give you a list that shows lots of different possibilities for, in this case, this is looking at a lobster fishery, and it's looking at the management measures for those. And all these little red, orange, yellow, green, and blue dots are giving an indication of what are some of the strengths and weaknesses. And in FishPath, you can click on those and it will give you a description saying, well, you answered this about a particular question. Like, for example, is the fishing community cooperative with the government on providing data? Based on your answer to this technique looks like it would be a good technique, a bad technique, maybe a technique that could go either way, but here's an important consideration. So when you go through FishPath and look at this for those three key sections, data, assessment, and management measures, it helps to be able to give you a clearer picture of what it is that might be useful techniques for that. And so this is a key aspect of developing an aim-based approach to fisheries. I'm sure many of you have heard of FishPath. It's still an emerging technique, but it's one that is now being used a whole bunch of different places around the world, as evidence is indicated in this map. All right, but now the fourth step of implementing the harvest strategy part of AIM is not well captured in FishPath, but something I've done some specific work to develop tools for, and that's the harvest control rule. So what is a harvest control rule? Let's start by making sure everybody's clear about that. Harvest control rule is a predefined formula that describes if we should be changing the amount of fishing opportunity that is being allowed, and if so, whether it's going to increase or decrease. So the formula takes the result of a stock assessment, which can be something as simple as just one or more indicators of stock health, runs it into this formula, and it spits out a conclusion about what changes might have to be made in terms of how restrictive fishing is. As I'm sure it's no surprise to people hearing that, this turns out to be hugely influential for the performance that we get from fisheries, because that formula is quite literally telling us how much fishing can be allowed. And there's two aspects of harvest control rules that are especially important: the target and the responsiveness. And just to make sure that this is really grounded in recognition that we use this, when it comes to calculating OY within NOAA through the Magnuson Act framework, we almost always use harvest control rules. There's a very common one that's used all over the West Coast, but used in other places too, is called the 40-10 policy, where the target is 40% spawning potential ratio. It's an abundance level that we deem to be relatively safe for most fisheries. The 10 indicates that we're going to scale fishing down if we're below that 40% level, and end all fishing if we get down to 10%. That scaling down from 40 to 10 is a form of responsiveness. It's how dramatically we're responding if the stock status changes over time. So those two things, I could go into that in great detail, and in fact, I'm providing another link to a talk where I covered that a bit more that you can look at further. There's some really cool mathematical theory I developed for understanding those choices and how they directly translate between what the harvest control rule looks like and what kind of performance you get out of it. But a key aspect with this is that the formula must be strictly followed, or else it kind of loses its value. One of the great values of harvest strategies in general is that we've committed to making changes based on this formula. That means we can do things quickly. We can catch problems before they develop into big problems. It also means that as analysts, somebody can come to me and say, I'm thinking about this harvest control rule for this fishery, and I can give very detailed analysis of the strengths and weaknesses of that harvest control rule by assuming that that's the amount of fishing that's going to be allowed. But if the formula is a little bit hazy and we're going to allow some wiggle room around that, it's much more difficult to analyze. All right, so as I mentioned, there is a theory to guide choices for harvest control rule. I'm not going to go into the details of that in the interest in time, but certainly feel free to watch that YouTube video that I provide where I get into some more of that. I will also just highlight very quickly that I have a beta version app specifically to assist in the design of harvest control rules, and there's a link provided here that you can follow up later. All right, I'm going to skim over this again in the interest of time, but I did really want to highlight how the AIM approach is different from how we typically do things. And so management plan review timing is one of the differences. Traditionally, when it comes to doing a review of a management plan, we typically wait until there's some new legal requirement that tells us we have to, or some problem emerges that says, oh, we're kind of in trouble, we really need to do this. That is not conducive to performance. That's only making changes in performance if things get really bad. The AIM approach says to do it differently. It says we're going to do this on a regular basis, and the minute that we are dissatisfied with the performance, not because it's disastrous, but just because it's not quite what we were hoping for, that's the opportunity to be able to make a review and a revision. Because of that, whereas traditional approaches, typically we do monitoring and evaluation, just covering some very standard things without a particular strategic focus of what the fisheries particulars are, the AIM approach really emphasizes the fact that monitoring and evaluation need to be very tied to those specific conflicts and trade-offs in a fishery. And so we shouldn't just be doing this generically. We should be designing monitoring and evaluation to really get at what are the fundamental issues within a particular fishery. When it comes to harvest strategy, that's words that sometimes gets used fairly broadly. Within the AIM approach, because harvest strategy complements that management plan process, the harvest strategy really is only a harvest strategy if it's a fast-acting adaptive management cycle and it's designed with that, including a commitment to following the harvest control rule formula. A really wonky thing, I won't get into the details of why, but in the AIM approach, we define the harvest control rule units differently. It's catch rate instead of fishing mortality rate. There's differences in reference points, which really gets at this idea of what is it that we're striving for in our fishery management systems. Traditionally, targets are based on MSY with some reduction for uncertainty. In the AIM approach, the target is explicitly chosen to produce desired performance across competing objectives. And sometimes, and this will be the case in an example I'm about to show you, MSY is not even a relevant issue. We don't even need to know MSY because it really is not part of our consideration of a target. We typically talk about limit reference points, and in the traditional approach, a limit reference point is typically used as an abundance that some fraction of the MSY, where if we're below the limit, we call it overfished. Or we say that there's a certain amount of fishing if that's something close to FMSY, and if we go over that, we're doing overfishing. That's typically how those reference points are used. In the AIM approach, we distinguish between two different types of limit reference points, thresholds and triggers. Thresholds are ones which, if we end up going beneath a threshold, that's a danger sign. And that is a trigger that says we should probably look at, maybe we need to review, akin to a limit that says we're overfished if we're below a certain level. But we also have trigger reference points, which is to say places in our harvest control rule where if we drop below a certain level, it triggers some additional automated action. It's not nearly as severe as a threshold limit, but it's one where it encourages us to think about ways of catching problems before they become bigger problems. And lastly, responsiveness turns out to be really important. I've mentioned this a few times. In the traditional approach, we don't really focus on that explicitly. It tends to be an indirect byproduct of other decisions regarding the rule. Whereas in the AIM approach, responsiveness and target are the two things above all else that we choose when it comes to a harvest control rule. And so it's something that we explicitly analyze in terms of performance trade-offs. I refer you to the more technical talk for more detail on that. Okay, skip that slide. Just again, I want to make sure I'm honoring people's times, and I know examples will be more of greater interest. So I'm going to run through this example fairly quickly because it's pretty straightforward, but it's a great illustration of exactly how AIM is supposed to work. Along with some other folks in NOAA and with folks from U.S. Agency for International Development, I have worked in Indonesia for several years building technical capacity. We got approached by a guy who had attended some of our workshops and had gone off and of his own initiative collected 1 year of data on an anchovy fishery in an extremely remote, extremely poor, more or less completely unmanaged part of Indonesia. And he chose that fishery because there was a really significant conflict there. Locals had traditionally fished from beaches using nets to catch anchovy, and that was an important source of food and income. But there had been an industrial fleet of, industrial does not look like our industrial, but still by comparison, an industrial fleet of lift net boats that were catching anchovy farther offshore using lift nets, and they were using those anchovy for a skipjack tuna fishery as live bait. So when the industrial boats came in, they reduced the number of anchovy to a point where locals could not catch them anymore using their traditional method. But when we did analysis, the analysis suggested that from an MSY perspective, there was not, we weren't having an issue, that if all we wanted from this fishery was to be able to support this industrial fleet, which provided a lot of economic opportunity for Indonesia, if not necessarily so much locally, that there wasn't a problem. But there was a problem because the abundance of anchovy that was left as a result of the reductions from this fishery meant that the local traditional fishery could not be supported, which is also something that's prioritized in Indonesian law. So Indonesians agreed that what we needed to do was figure out a way to be able to get the anchovy population back up to a size where it would rehabilitate the local fishery. We don't know what abundance is going to do that because we don't have any data on that. So we've started with a guess. And let me get into the details of that. So we use a harvest control rule for this fishery that adjusts the number of those lift net boats that are permitted. And that is based on comparing the current status of the population to a target. And what we know right now is that the target has to be higher than the current because we're not achieving what we're after, but we're not sure quite how high. So we make a highly uncertain guess, but this really honestly requires zero consideration of MSY. But because we're making a guess and we know we're moving in the right direction, we've also committed that we are going to come back and revisit this issue within the course of maybe like 5 years to see if we have better information there to do a better job of honing that target so that we are achieving this goal of rehabilitating the local fishery while providing whatever opportunity is appropriate for these industrial boats in the same area. This is an illustration of AIM, and the approach that we took very much followed everything I've just presented to you on AIM. I'm going to really quickly point out that AIM is being applied right now to Alaska in their statewide rockfish initiative. I've been working with the Department of Fish and Game on that, specifically starting with black and yellow eye rockfish. It is also being applied to Pacific fisheries in Mexico along Baja California for a multi-species fishery that has received marine stewardship conditional certification, but their fishery improvement plan is asking for them to have a system that is a well-functioning version of adaptive management with a harvest strategy. So we are applying this this technique to that fishery as well at this very moment. In terms of moving forward, the US continues to provide leadership internationally, and I'm very, very grateful that I get to work with NOAA teams in places like Indonesia, where we're expanding to more regions. The Philippines, we are tantalizingly close to working through that, and very hopeful that political developments there are not going to get in the way of us being able to do some wonderful work there. There's growing interest by both the US and specific countries within Southeast Asia for a regional approach that would basically be applying AIM to many different fisheries, and as well as additional expressions of interest from places like Colombia and St. Vincent and the Grenadines, very far from Asia. So I want to end with just a little provocative thinking about the potential to be able to use AIM for US domestic fisheries. And so to do that, I want to highlight that we still have lots of data limited fisheries. US territories are renowned for that. And NOAA is currently doing some effort in the US Caribbean, and I know also working specifically in American Samoa to be able to do a better job of applying the concepts of EBFM, even with limited data, but the AIM approach could really complement that. Within the US, there are lots of state fisheries that have limited resources, and I was certainly surprised when Alaska reached out and asked for this help, but if Alaska's asking for it, you can bet that there's lots of other states that could potentially benefit from it. But even within federal management, in places that are not US territories, there's all these minor federally managed fish stocks and potential to be able to apply AIM in those particular cases. But even more, we can potentially take some lessons from AIM and apply them to our flagship stocks, the ones that deservedly we hold up with pride as having managed well. And where can AIM come in? One is climate adaptation. These two adaptive management cycles are really powerful for navigating through an uncertain and changing environment. That is climate change and the challenge that we're facing forward. So applying AIM, specifically thinking of climate adaptation, is one really great potential for being able to do an even better job within the US. But then the second is to recognize that in the rush to put together all of our harvest control rules and the really significant changes that came from the 96 Magnuson Act revision, the Sustainable Fisheries Act, that a lot of what is out there actually looks a little bit formulaic. There's a whole bunch of fish stocks that use that 40-10 harvest control rule, despite the fact that harvest control rules provide, depending upon how you create them, they provide very different performance in terms of ecology, and socioeconomic benefits, the very things that are supposed to define MSY. So there's potential to use AIM as a way of revisiting harvest control rules in a way that sounds daunting, but I can say from my own experience, I feel very confident would end up actually engendering better engagement and more of a sense of involvement by fishing communities rather than less. And the other thing that we could do that would have that similar effect on fishing communities is be more explicit about a review process that's really focused on performance in the form of these conflicts and trade-offs. I'm going to end there so we have at least a couple of minutes for questions. But once again, just really want to thank everybody for your attention, and really want to thank the organizers for the opportunity to have presented today.
Thanks so much. So I'm going to give everyone a couple of minutes to type in their questions into the questions panel, and we'll get to those in just a moment.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, I'm not seeing any questions coming through. Peg, is there anything that you would like to add before we wrap up today?
No, thank you, Claire. I just want to thank Josh for taking the time and the effort to make this presentation. A fabulous and very thoughtful presentation, lots of ideas for us to think about. So I really appreciate that, Josh, you taking the time. And just quickly, a reminder, our July 13th presentation will focus in on the Northeast Habitat Regional Assessment project that's underway and supported by the Mid-Atlantic Fisheries Management Council. So stay tuned for that. So thank you again, Josh. Great presentation.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you all so much for joining us. That is all we have time for today. Thank you to our speaker. Thank you everyone who attended. You will be able to find this presentation on YouTube later this afternoon. When the presentation ends, you will see a survey. If you could take the time to fill this out, we do use the surveys to improve marketing our library seminar service and to inform future seminar topics. Thank you again for joining us and have a great rest of your day.